The control tower at Meridian Naval Air Station went completely silent. Not the kind of quiet that comes before a storm, but the suffocating hush that follows something impossible. On every radar screen, telemetry display, and flight monitor, the same impossible data streamed in real time. An A-18F Super Hornet was executing a vertical climb sequence that defied every safety protocol they knew. The pilot wasn't just flying the aircraft, she was dancing with physics itself, pulling maneuvers that belonged in air shows, not training exercises. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you. Make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Commander Jake Harrison gripped his coffee cup so hard his knuckles went white, watching as the aircraft rolled inverted at 3,000 feet, held the position for exactly 4 seconds, then transitioned into a knife-edge pass that skimmed the runway at 200 miles per hour. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for his radio, but before he could speak, the voice came through the headset. Clear, calm, professional. Meridian Tower, this is Meridian 7, requesting permission for Blue Angel's Diamond Formation demonstration. Authorization code Tango Alpha 77. The room erupted. Not in cheers or applause, but in frantic whispers and the rapid shuffling of personnel trying to verify what they'd just heard. Because nobody at Meridian Naval Air Station was authorized to fly Blue Angel's formations. Nobody was even qualified. Except, apparently, the quiet civilian flight instructor they'd reluctantly allowed into their most advanced fighter jet that morning. The morning sun painted the Gulf Coast in shades of amber and gold, casting long shadows across the tarmac at Meridian Naval Air Station. Heat waves already danced above the concrete, despite the early hour, and the thick Mississippi air carried the familiar mixture of jet fuel, salt from the nearby Gulf, and the metallic tang of aircraft maintenance. The base stretched across hundreds of acres of reclaimed swampland, its runways and hangars positioned with military precision among the coastal landscape. Spanish moss hung from ancient oak trees that had somehow survived the base's construction, creating an almost surreal contrast between nature's chaos and military order. Hangar 7 dominated the eastern section of the flight line. Its massive steel doors rolled back to reveal the gleaming forms of 3 A-18F Super Hornets. These weren't the older legacy Hornets that many pilots had trained on, but the newest generation of naval aviation technology. Each aircraft represented nearly $90 million of engineering excellence, their twin tails reaching toward the hangar's curved ceiling like cathedral spires dedicated to the art of flight. The morning light caught the polished surfaces of their intake cowlings, creating patterns of reflection that shifted and moved as maintenance crews performed their pre-flight inspections. The sound of the base was its own language. The distant whine of auxiliary power units spinning up, the rhythmic thump of rotor blades from helicopters practicing touch-and-go landings on the parallel strip, the sharp crack of metal striking metal as ordnance crews loaded practice rounds into wing pylons. Underneath it all was the constant hum of activity that never quite stopped at a military installation, a bass note of purpose that vibrated through the ground and into the bones of anyone who stood still long enough to feel it. Chief Master Sergeant Tom Bradley moved between the aircraft with the measured pace of someone who had spent 30 years ensuring that flying machines remained in perfect condition. His weathered hands traced inspection patterns that had become second nature, checking fluid levels, examining control surfaces, and running diagnostic cables with the efficiency of a man who understood that pilot lives depended on his attention to detail. At 52, Bradley had seen more aircraft configurations than most people could name, but the Super Hornet still impressed him. The engineering was elegant in its complexity, each system designed to work in harmony with dozens of others, creating a machine that could accelerate from 0 to Mach 1, 8 in conditions that would destroy lesser aircraft. The maintenance bay adjacent to Hangar 7 buzzed with different energy. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Here, younger technicians huddled over computer terminals, monitoring diagnostic systems that could identify potential failures before they occurred. The technology had advanced dramatically since Bradley's early career, when troubleshooting meant physically examining every component and relying on experience to identify problems. Now artificial intelligence algorithms predicted maintenance needs, and computer systems could simulate thousands of flight hours in minutes. Yet Bradley still insisted on the old methods, the hands-on inspection that no computer could replicate. Captain Mike Torres arrived at the hangar complex driving a government-issued pickup truck, its white paint dulled by months of coastal humidity and salt exposure. As the senior test pilot for Meridian's evaluation programs, Torres had accumulated over 4,000 flight hours in various military aircraft, including significant time in both Legacy and Super Hornets. His reputation was built on precision and an almost obsessive attention to safety protocols. At 38, he had reached the point in his career where younger pilots looked to him for guidance, while senior officers trusted his judgment on aircraft performance and pilot capabilities. Torres parked near the hangar entrance and sat for a moment, reviewing the day's flight schedule on his tablet. The morning would include 3 evaluation flights, routine proficiency checks for pilots, transitioning to the Super Hornet platform. 2 of the pilots were Navy officers with extensive experience in other aircraft types. The third was a civilian contractor, part of an experimental program designed to evaluate whether experienced civilian pilots could adapt to military aircraft systems with reduced training time. The program was controversial, with many military aviators questioning whether civilians could meet the standards required for tactical aircraft operation. The civilian pilot in question had been a source of discussion throughout the base for the past week. Sarah Mitchell had arrived with impressive credentials on paper, over 3,000 flight hours, instructor ratings in multiple aircraft types, and experience in high-performance civilian aircraft. Her background check had come back clean, with references from flight schools and aviation maintenance facilities throughout the Gulf Coast region. Yet something about her seemed deliberately unremarkable, as if she were trying to avoid attention rather than seek it. Torres had reviewed her file multiple times, searching for details that might explain his unease. Her flight experience was extensive, but scattered across different locations and employers. She had worked as an instructor, a ferry pilot, a maintenance technician, and even a banner tow pilot during tourist seasons. The pattern suggested someone who was skilled but unwilling or unable to commit to a single career path. Her personal information was equally sparse. No military service record, no advanced degrees, no participation in civilian aerobatic competitions or aviation organizations that might indicate exceptional skill. What bothered Torres most was the gap in her employment history. For nearly 8 years, from 2016 to 2024, Sarah Mitchell's documented aviation activities were minimal. A few scattered instructor positions, occasional maintenance work, but nothing that would account for someone with her apparent experience level. It was as if she had deliberately stepped away from serious aviation involvement for nearly a decade, maintaining just enough activity to keep her ratings current. The base's Flight Operations Center occupied a 3-story building adjacent to the main runway, its windows offering commanding views of aircraft movements throughout the facility. Commander Jake Harrison stood in his second-floor office, watching as ground crews positioned equipment for the morning's activities. At 45, Harrison had commanded flight operations at 3 different naval installations, earning a reputation for running efficient, safe programs while maintaining the high operational tempo required by modern military aviation. Harrison's office reflected his personality, organized, functional, and focused on the mission. Flight schedules covered one wall, updated hourly to reflect changes in weather, aircraft availability, and pilot assignments. Another wall displayed photographs from his own flying career, including images from carrier deployments and training exercises around the world. His desk held multiple computer monitors showing real-time information about aircraft status, weather conditions, and air traffic control communications. The experimental civilian pilot program had been Harrison's initiative, developed in response to military leadership concerns about pilot recruitment and training costs. If experienced civilian aviators could successfully transition to military aircraft with reduced training time, it could offer significant savings in both time and resources. The program had approval for 6 months of evaluation, with 3 civilian pilots participating in various phases of assessment. Sarah Mitchell was the second participant, following a corporate pilot who had successfully completed basic familiarization training, but struggled with tactical maneuvering exercises. Harrison had personally interviewed Sarah Mitchell during her initial evaluation, finding her professional but curiously reserved. She answered questions directly and demonstrated extensive technical knowledge about aircraft systems and flight procedures. Yet she seemed uncomfortable with attention, deflecting questions about her background and focusing instead on technical discussions about aircraft performance and safety protocols. Her simulator performance had been exceptional, suggesting familiarity with high-performance aircraft that exceeded what her documented experience would indicate. The morning briefing was scheduled for 800 hours in Conference Room Alpha, located on the first floor of the Flight Operations Center. The room was designed for efficiency rather than comfort, with 24 chairs arranged in rows facing a presentation screen and podium. Maps of the local training areas covered the walls, marked with altitude restrictions, special use airspace boundaries, and emergency landing sites. A digital display showed current weather conditions, forecasted changes throughout the day, and notices to airmen that might affect flight operations. Lieutenant Emma Rodriguez arrived early for the briefing, carrying a tablet loaded with flight procedures and aircraft technical manuals. At 26, Rodriguez was among the youngest pilots, assigned to Meridian, having completed flight training just 18 months earlier. Her assignment to the base represented her first operational tour, and she approached every flight with the mixture of enthusiasm and nervousness that characterized newly winged aviators. Rodriguez had volunteered to participate in the civilian pilot evaluation program, curious about how civilian training methods might differ from military instruction. Rodriguez had encountered Sarah Mitchell twice during the previous week, both times in the base library where military and civilian personnel could access technical publications and training materials. Mitchell had been reading maintenance manuals for the A-18F, taking detailed notes in a spiral-bound notebook that she kept carefully organized. When Rodriguez had attempted casual conversation, Mitchell had been polite but distant, answering questions briefly before returning to her studies. The interaction had left Rodriguez with the impression that Mitchell was intensely focused but also somewhat isolated from the social aspects of aviation culture. The base library occupied a quiet corner of the administrative complex, its shelves lined with technical manuals, historical documents, and professional journals related to naval aviation. Sarah Mitchell had spent considerable time there during her first week at Meridian, ostensibly familiarizing herself with Super Hornet systems and procedures. In reality, she was trying to reconcile the aircraft she would be flying with the memories of the legacy Hornet she had once known intimately. 8 years was a significant gap in aviation technology. The Super Hornet shared basic design principles with the legacy Hornet, but the systems were substantially different. Advanced electronic warfare capabilities, improved radar systems, and enhanced flight control computers had transformed the aircraft's capabilities. Mitchell studied these changes methodically, creating detailed notes that compared new systems with older ones she remembered. Her notebook contained diagrams, system flowcharts, and performance data that would have impressed any instructor, but she kept it private, reviewing the materials alone during off-duty hours. The apartment where Mitchell lived during her evaluation period was located 15 minutes from the base, in a complex that catered to temporary military personnel and civilian contractors. Harbor View Complex consisted of 12 two-story buildings arranged around a central courtyard, with each unit furnished for short-term occupancy. Mitchell's apartment, number 12B, was on the second floor of the easternmost building, offering views of Mobile Bay through windows that faced the morning sun. The apartment reflected Mitchell's preference for simplicity and functionality. She had added nothing to the basic furnishings except for a small collection of aviation publications and a laptop computer that she used for study and communication. Her personal belongings fit into 2 suitcases and a hanging bag, suggesting someone accustomed to temporary living arrangements. The refrigerator contained basic necessities, and her daily routine involved early morning runs along the bayfront, followed by study time before reporting to the base. Mitchell's runs took her along a 3-mile loop that followed the shoreline of Mobile Bay, offering views of the naval installations and civilian maritime facilities that dotted the coast. The route provided solitude and physical conditioning, but also served as reconnaissance. From various points along the waterfront, she could observe aircraft movements at Meridian and the adjacent civilian airports, noting patterns of activity and operational procedures. This information wasn't required for her evaluation program, but old habits of situational awareness died hard. During these morning runs, Mitchell occasionally encountered other military personnel from various installations in the area. The Gulf Coast hosted multiple bases and training facilities, creating a community of service members who often shared recreational areas and local establishments. Mitchell remained polite but distant during these encounters, introducing herself as a civilian contractor when necessary, but avoiding detailed conversations about her background or current assignment. The civilian aviation community in the Gulf Shores area was small and close-knit, consisting primarily of flight instructors, charter pilots, and recreational aviators who flew for personal enjoyment. Mitchell had worked sporadically within this community for several years, taking temporary positions that allowed her to maintain her ratings and earn income without committing to permanent employment. Her reputation was solid but unremarkable, a competent pilot and instructor who completed assignments professionally but didn't socialize extensively or participate in the informal networks that connected most aviation professionals. Sunset Aviation Flight School, where Mitchell had worked most recently, operated from a small terminal building at Gulf Shores Regional Airport. The school specialized in training recreational pilots and providing transition training for pilots moving between different aircraft types. Mitchell had served as a part-time instructor, teaching primarily in Cessna 172s and Piper Cherokees to students working toward private pilot certificates. Her instruction style was thorough and safety-focused, earning positive feedback from students, but she had declined opportunities for full-time employment or advancement to chief instructor positions. The flight school's owner, Bob Martinez, had known Mitchell for nearly 3 years, but still considered her something of a mystery. She was clearly overqualified for basic instruction work, demonstrating knowledge of advanced aircraft systems and flight procedures that exceeded the requirements for training private pilots. When Martinez had asked about her background, Mitchell had mentioned previous experience as a corporate pilot and maintenance technician, but provided few specific details. Her references had been impeccable, and her instruction quality was excellent. So Martinez had never pressed for more information. Martinez had been surprised when Mitchell informed him that she would be unavailable for several weeks due to a temporary assignment with the military. She had been characteristically vague about the details, mentioning only that it involved aircraft evaluation work at Meridian Naval Air Station. Martinez had assumed it was some form of civilian technical support role, possibly related to maintenance or ground operations. The possibility that Mitchell might be flying military aircraft had never occurred to him. as nothing in her background suggested that level of experience or security clearance. The morning of Sarah Mitchell's first Super Hornet flight began with the same routine that had governed her life for 8 years: awakening before dawn, checking weather conditions, and reviewing technical materials related to her upcoming activities. However, this morning carried weight that she hadn't felt since leaving active duty. For the first time in nearly a decade, she would be flying an aircraft capable of supersonic flight, equipped with systems designed for combat operations, and operated according to military standards that demanded perfection rather than merely adequate performance. Mitchell's preparation extended beyond the standard pre-flight procedures required for civilian aircraft. She reviewed emergency procedures for situations that civilian pilots rarely encountered: engine fires at high altitude, electrical failures in complex avionics systems, and recovery techniques for aircraft upset conditions at speeds approaching Mach 2. The Super Hornet was designed to operate in environments that would destroy civilian aircraft, and its pilots needed to be prepared for scenarios that existed at the extreme edges of flight envelope. As Mitchell drove to Meridian Naval Air Station that morning, she passed landmarks that had become familiar during her weeks of preparation. The route took her through small coastal communities where commercial fishing boats shared harbors with recreational sailing vessels, past industrial facilities that supported the region's petroleum and shipping industries, and finally through the security checkpoint that separated the military installation from the civilian world. The security checkpoint represented more than a physical barrier. For Mitchell, it marked the boundary between the carefully constructed civilian identity she had maintained for 8 years and the military aviator she had once been. Each time she presented her temporary access credentials to the security guards, she felt the weight of concealed history, the knowledge that her true qualifications far exceeded what anyone at Meridian suspected. The morning briefing would begin in 30 minutes, bringing together the pilots, maintenance personnel, and support staff involved in the day's evaluation flights. Mitchell knew that her performance would be scrutinized by experienced military aviators who had legitimate doubts about civilian capabilities in tactical aircraft. She also knew that exceeding their expectations might raise questions about her background that she wasn't prepared to answer. The challenge would be demonstrating competence without revealing expertise that would be impossible to explain given her documented history. As Mitchell parked her rental car in the visitor section of the base parking area, she could hear the distant sound of aircraft engines warming up for the day's first flights. The sound triggered memories that she had spent 8 years trying to suppress: the roar of 6 Blue Angels aircraft in close formation, the precision required to maintain 18-inch wingtip separation at 400 miles per hour, and the indescribable sensation of flying so close to other aircraft that their wake turbulence became a physical force requiring constant correction. Those memories belonged to a different person, someone who had worn a different name and lived a different life. Today, she was simply Sarah Mitchell, civilian pilot, participating in an evaluation program that might lead to expanded opportunities for non-military aviators. She gathered her flight bag and notebook, locked the car, and walked toward Hangar 7, where the most advanced fighter aircraft in naval aviation waited to test whether she could still remember how to fly like the warrior she had once been. Conference Room Alpha filled gradually as the morning briefing approached, the steady stream of personnel creating the familiar atmosphere of pre-flight preparation that characterized military aviation operations. Sarah Mitchell entered the room precisely at 7:55, carrying only a standard-issue notebook and a government ballpoint pen. She selected a seat in the third row, neither prominently positioned nor hidden in the back, maintaining the careful balance of visibility that had become second nature during her civilian career. Captain Torres entered moments later, his flight suit bearing the worn patches and faded colors that indicated extensive use rather than ceremonial display. His movements carried the confident efficiency of a senior pilot who had conducted thousands of briefings, but his eyes lingered briefly on Mitchell as he passed her row. The scrutiny wasn't hostile, merely professional curiosity about the civilian participant, who would be flying military hardware worth more than most people earned in a lifetime. Lieutenant Rodriguez arrived with two other junior officers. Their conversation focused on weekend plans and the latest changes to base dining facility menus. The casual chatter represented the social bonds that held military units together, the informal connections that complemented official command structures. Mitchell observed these interactions without participating, noting the easy familiarity that came from shared experiences and common purpose. It was a culture she had once inhabited naturally, but now felt foreign despite its familiarity. Commander. Harrison entered precisely at 800 hours, carrying a leather portfolio that contained the day's operational details. His presence immediately shifted the room's atmosphere from casual to professional, conversations ending without explicit command as personnel prepared for the formal briefing. Harrison's reputation for punctuality and thoroughness preceded him, creating expectations that influenced behavior before he spoke his first word. The briefing began with standard administrative items: weather updates, airspace restrictions, and maintenance status reports for the aircraft scheduled to fly. The morning forecast called for clear skies with light winds, ideal conditions for evaluation flights that would test pilot performance rather than weather management skills. Visibility extended beyond 20 miles, and temperature conditions would minimize density-altitude effects that could complicate aircraft performance calculations. Harrison's presentation style reflected his operational background, delivering information efficiently while ensuring complete understanding among all participants. He covered emergency procedures specific to the day's flights, communication protocols for coordination with air traffic control, and safety parameters that would govern all activities. The briefing materials had been prepared with the assumption that all participants possessed basic military aviation knowledge, requiring Mitchell to demonstrate familiarity with procedures she hadn't used in 8 years. When Harrison reached the portion of the briefing dedicated to individual flight assignments, the room's attention focused more intently on the civilian pilot whose presence represented something unprecedented in the base's operational history. Mitchell's flight would be the second of 3 scheduled evaluations, positioned between 2 military pilots whose qualifications were well established. The sequencing was deliberate, allowing observation of her performance in context with known standards. Torres would serve as her evaluating pilot, occupying the rear seat of the F/A-18F during a flight profile that included basic maneuvering, system familiarization, and emergency procedure demonstrations. The evaluation criteria had been adapted from standard military check rides, modified to account for civilian training backgrounds that might differ from military instruction methods. Success would be measured not against combat pilot standards, but against the minimum requirements for safe operation of the aircraft. The briefing concluded with individual consultations between evaluating pilots and their assigned candidates. Mitchell approached Torres's desk area, where charts and performance data were spread across a folding table that served as a temporary workspace. Torres gestured for her to sit in the metal chair that had been positioned beside the table, creating an informal conference setting within the larger briefing room. Torres opened Mitchell's evaluation folder, reviewing documents that summarized her civilian flying experience and the results of preliminary assessments conducted during her first week at the base. The simulator sessions had produced exceptional scores, particularly in emergency procedures and system management tasks that challenged many military pilots. Her academic performance on written examinations had been similarly impressive, suggesting thorough preparation and strong technical knowledge. However, Torres had learned to distinguish between academic preparation and practical flying ability. Simulators provided valuable training, but they couldn't replicate the physical and psychological demands of actual flight in high-performance aircraft. The sensory inputs, spatial orientation challenges, and physiological effects of sustained G-forces required adaptation that no ground-based training could fully provide. Many pilots who excelled in classroom and simulator environments struggled when transitioning to actual aircraft operations. Torres began the individual briefing by reviewing the planned flight profile, using a sectional chart to identify the training areas where various maneuvers would be demonstrated. The route would take them over the Gulf of Mexico, away from civilian air traffic and populated areas where military training activities were prohibited. The designated airspace extended from the surface to 40,000 feet, providing adequate room for the full range of evaluations planned for the flight. Conversation revealed Mitchell's thorough preparation for the evaluation. She asked informed questions about the Super Hornet's differences from civilian aircraft, particularly regarding engine response characteristics and flight control system behavior. Her questions demonstrated understanding of complex aerodynamic principles and system integration concepts that exceeded the knowledge level of most civilian pilots. Torres found himself providing more detailed, technical explanations than he had anticipated, responding to inquiries that suggested extensive background in high-performance aircraft operations. When Torres mentioned the aircraft's capability for supersonic flight, Mitchell's response was notably restrained. Rather than expressing the excitement or apprehension that characterized most civilian pilots when discussing such performance, she simply nodded, asked about the specific procedures for transonic acceleration. Her question focused on practical, operational considerations rather than the novelty of exceeding the speed of sound, suggesting familiarity with such operations that seemed inconsistent with her documented background. The individual briefing extended longer than Torres had planned, primarily due to Mitchell's detailed questions about aircraft systems and emergency procedures. Her preparation level exceeded his expectations, and her technical knowledge approached that of military pilots with considerable experience in tactical aircraft. Yet her personal demeanor remained carefully neutral, providing information when asked but volunteering little about her background or previous flying experiences. As the briefing concluded, Torres experienced the same unease that had characterized his previous interactions with Mitchell. Her qualifications appeared genuine, her preparation was thorough, and her attitude was professional. However, something about her suggested capabilities that exceeded her documented experience, creating questions about aspects of her background that weren't reflected in her official records. The inconsistency was subtle but persistent, like a frequency that remained just beyond the range of clear reception. The walk from the briefing room to Hangar 7 took Mitchell through areas of the base that she hadn't previously visited, past maintenance facilities and administrative buildings that housed the complex support structure required for military aviation operations. The base was larger than most civilian airports, with specialized facilities for everything from ordnance handling to weather monitoring. The infrastructure represented decades of investment in capabilities that existed nowhere in the civilian aviation world. Hangar 7 appeared different when approached as an active participant rather than an observer. The massive steel structure seemed both protective and intimidating, sheltering aircraft that embodied the pinnacle of aerospace engineering, while representing the serious responsibilities that came with operating such sophisticated machinery. The A-18F Super Hornets resting inside the hangar weren't merely expensive equipment, but tools designed for missions where failure could have consequences extending far beyond individual safety. Chief Master Sergeant Bradley supervised the pre-flight preparation of tail number 165,543, the aircraft assigned for Mitchell's evaluation flight. Bradley's maintenance crews had completed their inspections before dawn, ensuring that every system met the exacting standards required for flight operations. The aircraft's logbooks documented a maintenance history that reflected the rigorous attention to detail that kept military aircraft operationally ready despite the demanding conditions under which they operated. Mitchell approached the aircraft with the measured pace that characterized experienced pilots, beginning pre-flight inspections. Her external examination of the Super Hornet was methodical and thorough, checking items that civilian pilots might overlook, but that were critical for high-performance operations. She examined the condition of engine intake screens, verified the security of external panels, and inspected flight control surfaces with attention to detail that impressed the maintenance personnel observing her work. Bradley watched Mitchell's inspection technique with professional interest, noting that her methods reflected training and experience that exceeded typical civilian standards. She examined components and systems with the systematic approach that characterized military pilots, checking items and sequences that suggested familiarity with pre-flight procedures for tactical aircraft. Her movements were confident and efficient, suggesting muscle memory developed through extensive practice rather than recently acquired knowledge. When Mitchell completed her external inspection, she paused at the base of the aircraft's boarding ladder, looking up at the cockpit that would be her workspace for the next 2 hours. The moment represented a threshold between her carefully maintained civilian identity and the military capabilities she had concealed for 8 years. Once she climbed into the aircraft and began interacting with its systems, her true level of experience would become increasingly difficult to hide. Torres joined Mitchell at the aircraft, carrying his flight gear and the mission materials that would guide their evaluation flight. His own pre-flight inspection was brief but thorough, focusing on items that were particularly relevant to the day's planned activities. As the evaluating pilot, Torres bore responsibility for the safety and success of the flight, requiring him to verify that both the aircraft and his student were prepared for the challenges ahead. The process of strapping into the Super Hornet's cockpit involved complex procedures that differed significantly from civilian aircraft operations. Military ejection seats required careful attention to safety pin removal, harness routing, and survival equipment positioning. The cockpit itself contained dozens of switches, displays, and controls that needed to be configured properly before engine start. Mitchell's familiarity with these procedures was evident in her smooth execution of tasks that often challenged civilian pilots during their first exposure to tactical aircraft. From his position in the rear cockpit, Torres could observe Mitchell's interaction with the aircraft systems through intercom communications and by monitoring the displays that were duplicated in his station. Her preparation for engine start was methodical and correct, following the checklist procedures with precision, while maintaining awareness of the broader sequence of events required for flight preparation. Her radio communications with ground control were clear and professional, using proper terminology and procedures without hesitation. The Super Hornet's engines produced a distinctive sound as they wound up to idle power, a deep rumble that resonated through the aircraft structure and could be felt as much as heard. The sensation was familiar to Mitchell, triggering memories of countless engine starts in similar aircraft, but she maintained her composure while experiencing the emotional impact of returning to an environment she had abandoned 8 years earlier. Taxi operations at Meridian Naval Air Station required coordination with multiple ground control agencies and careful attention to the movement of other aircraft operating in the same area. Mitchell's handling of these procedures was smooth and confident, demonstrating familiarity with complex ground operations that civilian pilots rarely encountered. Her communication with air traffic control was precise and efficient, using standard phraseology without the hesitation that characterized pilots unfamiliar with military environments. The taxi to the active runway provided time for final systems checks and mental preparation for the evaluation flight ahead. Mitchell's cockpit management was organized and efficient, completing required checklist items while maintaining awareness of air traffic control instructions and the activities of other aircraft in the pattern. Her professional demeanor remained consistent, but Torres could sense an underlying tension that suggested the significance of the moment wasn't lost on her. As they approached the runway threshold, Mitchell's transformation became more apparent to Torres. Her radio communications became even more crisp and professional, her aircraft handling more precise, and her overall demeanor more focused than during ground operations. The change was subtle but unmistakable, suggesting that the approach to flight operations triggered responses that were deeply ingrained rather than recently learned. The takeoff clearance came from air traffic control with the routine efficiency that characterized thousands of daily aircraft departures from military installations around the world. However, for Mitchell, the moment represented something far more significant than a routine flight operation. As she advanced the throttles and felt the Super Hornet accelerate down the runway, she was crossing the threshold that she had avoided for 8 years, returning to a realm of aviation that she had once mastered but had deliberately abandoned. The Super Hornet lifted off smoothly, its powerful engines propelling the aircraft into a climb rate that civilian aircraft couldn't match. As the landing gear retracted and the aircraft transitioned from ground operations to flight mode, Mitchell felt the familiar sensation of piloting a machine designed for performance that existed at the very limits of current technology. The aircraft responded to control inputs with precision and authority, demanding attention and respect while offering capabilities that few pilots would ever experience. From his rear seat position, Torres monitored Mitchell's initial flight performance through the aircraft's instrumentation and his own observations of her technique. Her control of the aircraft was smooth and confident, suggesting familiarity with high-performance flight operations that exceeded his expectations. The transition from takeoff to cruise flight was executed with precision that impressed Torres, who had evaluated dozens of civilian pilots making their first flights in military aircraft. As they climbed through 10,000 feet and contacted departure control for clearance to the training area, Torres began to suspect that Sarah Mitchell's background contained elements that weren't reflected in her official documentation. Her performance during the flight's initial phases suggested experience and training that would be difficult to acquire through civilian channels alone. The question was whether such capabilities represented exceptional civilian training or something else entirely. The flight toward the designated training area provided opportunity for Mitchell to become reacquainted with the Super Hornet systems and flight characteristics. The aircraft's performance envelope was substantially different from the civilian aircraft she had been flying for the past 8 years, requiring mental and physical adaptation to operating procedures that demanded constant attention and precise execution. However, her adjustment period was remarkably brief, suggesting familiarity with similar aircraft that wasn't explained by her documented background. As they reached the training area and began the formal evaluation sequence, both Mitchell and Torres understood that the flight would provide answers to questions about civilian pilot capabilities in military aircraft. However, neither of them anticipated that the answers would raise even more complex questions about the true identity and background of the quiet civilian pilot who had somehow learned to fly tactical aircraft with the precision of a military professional. The training area extended across thousands of square miles of Gulf of Mexico airspace, designated for military use and carefully monitored to ensure separation from civilian aviation activities. The airspace provided freedom for aircraft to operate at performance levels that were prohibited in most areas, allowing evaluation of capabilities that could only be demonstrated in unrestricted conditions. For Mitchell, entering this environment represented a return to operational flying that she hadn't experienced since leaving active duty 8 years earlier. Torres began the formal evaluation by directing Mitchell through basic maneuvering exercises designed to assess her familiarity with the Super Hornet's flight characteristics and her ability to maintain aircraft control under various conditions. The exercises started with gentle turns and climbs, progressing gradually to more demanding maneuvers that would reveal her actual skill level and comfort with high-performance flight operations. Mitchell's execution of the initial maneuvers was precise and confident, demonstrating control techniques that suggested extensive experience in tactical aircraft. Her coordination of flight controls was smooth and efficient, maintaining desired flight parameters while managing the aircraft's complex systems simultaneously. Torres found himself providing less instruction and guidance than he had anticipated, observing performance that exceeded his expectations for a civilian pilot's first flight in a Super Hornet. The progression to more demanding exercises revealed capabilities that surprised Torres and raised questions about Mitchell's true background. Her execution of aileron rolls was textbook perfect, maintaining altitude and heading while demonstrating control precision that required extensive practice to achieve. Her performance during simulated engine failure procedures was similarly impressive, following correct protocols while maintaining aircraft control under conditions that challenged many military pilots. When Torres directed Mitchell to demonstrate her ability to handle the aircraft at higher performance levels, her responses revealed familiarity with operational procedures that civilian pilots rarely encountered. Her management of supersonic acceleration was smooth and professional, suggesting previous experience with transonic flight operations that wasn't reflected in her documented background. Her radio communications during high-speed flight were clear and precise, using terminology and procedures that indicated familiarity with tactical aviation environments. The most revealing portion of the evaluation occurred when Torres requested demonstration of formation flying techniques, a skill set that was rarely developed outside military aviation. Mitchell's response was initially hesitant, suggesting reluctance rather than inability. However, when pressed to demonstrate basic formation positions relative to Torres's verbal directions, her performance was exceptional. Maintaining precise positions and responding to commands with accuracy that approached professional formation flying standards. As the evaluation flight progressed, Torres found himself increasingly puzzled by Mitchell's capabilities. Her performance exceeded not only his expectations for civilian pilots, but approached the standards of experienced military aviators. Her familiarity with the Super Hornet systems, her precision in aircraft control, and her professional approach to complex flight operations suggested training and experience that would be extremely difficult to acquire through civilian channels alone. The final portion of the evaluation involved simulated emergency procedures that tested Mitchell's ability to respond appropriately to system failures and abnormal situations. Her performance was outstanding, demonstrating knowledge of procedures and decision-making processes that reflected extensive training in emergency management. Her responses were immediate and correct, suggesting familiarity with situations that civilian pilots might never encounter. As they began the return flight to Meridian Naval Air Station, Torres realized that his evaluation of Sarah Mitchell would require careful consideration. Her performance had exceeded all expectations, demonstrating capabilities that raised questions about her true background and qualifications. The quiet civilian pilot who had entered his aircraft that morning had revealed skills that suggested a history in military aviation that wasn't reflected in any of her documentation. The approach and landing at Meridian provided one final opportunity for Torres to assess Mitchell's capabilities. Her execution of the approach was precise and professional, maintaining proper speeds and configurations, while coordinating with air traffic control and managing the aircraft's complex systems. The landing itself was smooth and controlled, demonstrating mastery of techniques that many pilots found challenging in high-performance aircraft. As the engines wound down and they completed post-flight procedures, Torres sat in silence for several moments, considering the implications of what he had observed during the evaluation flight. Sarah Mitchell had not only met the standards expected of civilian pilots transitioning to military aircraft, but had demonstrated capabilities that suggested extensive previous experience in tactical aviation. The question was how such experience had been acquired and why it wasn't reflected in her official background documentation. The post-flight debrief would require careful handling, as Torres needed to document Mitchell's exceptional performance while addressing questions about capabilities that seemed inconsistent with her documented background. He also needed to decide whether to recommend her continuation in the evaluation program or to request additional investigation into aspects of her background that remained unexplained. As they climbed down from the aircraft and began the walk back to the briefing facilities, Torres realized that Sarah Mitchell represented something unprecedented in his experience as an evaluating pilot. She was clearly qualified to fly the Super Hornet, but the source of her qualifications remained a mystery that would require resolution before any final recommendations could be made. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the flight line. As maintenance personnel began their post-flight inspection of the aircraft that had just returned from the evaluation flight, the routine procedures of military aviation continued around them. But both Torres and Mitchell understood that the flight had raised questions that would require answers before the evaluation program could proceed. In the distance, other aircraft continued their training activities, their engine sounds creating the familiar background noise of military aviation operations. For Mitchell, the sounds triggered memories of a different time and place, when she had been part of a team that represented the pinnacle of military aviation excellence. Now walking across the tarmac as a civilian contractor, she wondered whether her carefully maintained anonymity could survive the scrutiny that her performance had undoubtedly generated. The debriefing session would take place in 1 hour, providing time for Torres to organize his observations and for Mitchell to prepare for questions that might probe deeper into her background than she was comfortable addressing. The evaluation flight had been successful from a performance standpoint, but it had also revealed capabilities that would be difficult to explain without acknowledging aspects of her history that she had spent 8 years trying to forget. As they reached the entrance to the briefing facility, Torres turned to Mitchell with an expression that mixed professional respect with obvious curiosity. His words were carefully chosen, reflecting his position as an evaluating officer while acknowledging the exceptional performance he had witnessed. The quiet civilian pilot, who had been dismissed by many as an experimental curiosity, had just demonstrated flying skills that rivaled those of the base's most experienced military aviators. The question now was whether she could maintain her carefully constructed civilian identity while continuing to participate in a program that would inevitably expose more of her true capabilities. The afternoon briefing would bring together the various personnel who had observed or participated in the evaluation flight, creating a forum where Mitchell's performance would be analyzed and discussed by military professionals who understood the significance of what they had witnessed. For 8 years, she had successfully avoided such scrutiny, but her return to high-performance military aviation had made continued anonymity increasingly difficult to maintain. As the door to the briefing facility closed behind them, both Torres and Mitchell understood that the evaluation flight had changed the dynamics of the civilian pilot program. What had been intended as a routine assessment of civilian capabilities had revealed something far more complex, raising questions about identity, background, and the true qualifications of a pilot who had somehow learned to fly like a military professional while maintaining the facade of civilian mediocrity. The debriefing room at Meridian Naval Air Station felt smaller than it had that morning, the fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows across the metal table where Captain Torres spread out his evaluation notes. Sarah Mitchell sat across from him, her flight suit still bearing the creases and salt stains from 2 hours of Gulf Coast flying, but her expression remained carefully neutral. The air conditioning hummed steadily, competing with the distant sound of aircraft operations that never truly ceased at a military installation. Torres had spent the past 30 minutes reviewing his observations from the evaluation flight, trying to reconcile what he had witnessed with the documented background of the civilian pilot sitting before him. His handwritten notes covered 3 pages of detailed observations, technical assessments, and questions that had no easy answers. The performance standards Mitchell had demonstrated were exceptional by any measure, but they raised fundamental questions about the accuracy of her documented qualifications and experience. The formal debriefing began with Torres reviewing the planned flight profile and comparing it to the actual execution of each phase. Mitchell's takeoff technique had been textbook perfect, her climb-out procedures efficient and professional. Her radio communications had demonstrated familiarity with military aviation protocols that civilian pilots rarely encountered. Most significantly, her aircraft handling throughout the flight had shown precision and confidence that suggested extensive experience in high-performance military aircraft. Mitchell listened to the assessment without interruption, occasionally nodding to acknowledge specific points, but offering no additional commentary about her performance. Her restraint was consistent with the pattern Torres had observed throughout their interactions, a deliberate limitation of information sharing that seemed designed to avoid revealing more than absolutely necessary. The behavior was professional, but unusual, creating an impression of someone actively managing the impression they created rather than simply participating in a routine evaluation. When Torres reached the portion of his notes dealing with formation flying demonstrations, Mitchell's posture shifted almost imperceptibly. The change was subtle but noticeable to someone trained to observe pilot behavior under stress. Her breathing remained steady, her hands remained relaxed on the table, but something in her expression suggested increased attention to the direction of the conversation. Torres noted the reaction and continued his assessment, describing her formation flying skills as exceptional and inconsistent with typical civilian pilot capabilities. The discussion of emergency procedures revealed perhaps the most significant discrepancies between Mitchell's documented background and her demonstrated abilities. Her responses to simulated system failures had been immediate and correct, following protocols that required extensive training and practice to execute properly. Her decision-making during abnormal situations had demonstrated judgment that came from experience rather than academic preparation. Most concerning from an evaluation standpoint, her familiarity with specific emergency procedures suggested training in systems and aircraft that weren't part of typical civilian aviation experience. Torres closed his evaluation notes and leaned back in his chair, studying Mitchell's face for any indication of how she might respond to direct questions about the inconsistencies he had observed. Her expression remained professionally neutral, but he sensed an underlying tension that suggested awareness of the direction their conversation was heading. The quiet civilian pilot who had impressed everyone with her technical knowledge was about to face questions that might require explanations she wasn't prepared to provide. The first direct question was carefully phrased to avoid accusatory implications while seeking clarification about specific aspects of Mitchell's background. Torres asked about her previous experience with high-performance aircraft, noting that her demonstrated skills suggested familiarity with operational procedures that were rarely encountered in civilian aviation. Mitchell's response was measured and brief, acknowledging that she had worked with various aircraft types throughout her career, but providing no specific details about the nature or extent of such experience. Torres pressed gently for more specific information, asking about Mitchell's familiarity with formation flying procedures and tactical aircraft systems. Her responses continued to be professionally appropriate, but deliberately limited, confirming basic knowledge while avoiding detailed explanations that might reveal the extent of her actual experience. The pattern of responses suggested someone who was being truthful within carefully defined boundaries, but who was also deliberately limiting the scope of information being shared. The conversation took on the characteristics of a careful dance, with Torres seeking information that might explain Mitchell's exceptional capabilities while Mitchell provided responses that acknowledged his questions without revealing details that might compromise her carefully maintained civilian identity. Both participants understood the underlying tension, but neither was prepared to directly address the fundamental question of whether Mitchell's documented background accurately reflected her true qualifications and experience. When Torres asked about specific aircraft types that Mitchell had flown, her response included mention of various civilian aircraft, but notably avoided reference to any military equipment. Her knowledge of the Super Hornet systems was explained as thorough preparation for the evaluation program, supported by extensive simulator time and technical study. Her formation flying skills were attributed to participation in civilian aerobatic training, though she provided no specific details about when or where such training had occurred. The most challenging portion of the debriefing involved Torres's observations about Mitchell's overall approach to flying the Super Hornet. Her comfort level with the aircraft had exceeded his expectations from the moment of engine start, suggesting familiarity that went beyond academic preparation or simulator experience. Her situational awareness during flight operations had been exceptional, demonstrating ability to manage complex tactical aircraft systems while maintaining awareness of external factors that could affect flight safety. Torres described his observations carefully, noting that Mitchell's performance had been outstanding while acknowledging questions about how such capabilities had been developed through civilian training alone. He emphasized that his concerns weren't related to her ability to safely operate the aircraft, but rather to understanding the background and experience that had produced such exceptional skills. The distinction was important, as it positioned the discussion as seeking information rather than questioning her qualifications. Mitchell's response to these observations was characteristically restrained, thanking Torres for his positive assessment while deflecting questions about the specific sources of her experience and training. She acknowledged that her performance had benefited from extensive preparation and previous flying experience, but maintained that such experience had been acquired through civilian channels over many years of aviation involvement. Her explanation was plausible but incomplete, leaving significant questions unanswered about the details of her background. The debriefing continued for another 20 minutes, with Torres seeking additional clarification about various aspects of Mitchell's performance while Mitchell provided responses that were professionally appropriate, but deliberately limited in scope. The dynamic created a conversation that was both informative and frustrating, yielding insights into Mitchell's capabilities while raising additional questions about the accuracy and completeness of her documented background. As the formal debriefing concluded, Torres realized that he would need to make recommendations about Mitchell's continuation in the evaluation program, based on incomplete information about her true qualifications and background. Her flight performance had exceeded all expectations and clearly demonstrated her ability to safely operate the Super Hornet under various conditions. However, the discrepancies between her documented experience and her demonstrated capabilities raised questions that would require resolution before final program recommendations could be made. Torres closed his evaluation folder and looked directly at Mitchell, his expression reflecting both professional respect for her exceptional performance and obvious curiosity about the unanswered questions surrounding her background. His final comments acknowledged her outstanding flight performance, while noting that additional administrative review might be required to clarify certain aspects of her qualifications and experience. The statement was diplomatically phrased, but clearly indicated that the evaluation process would continue beyond the flight portion of the assessment. Mitchell accepted Torres's comments without visible reaction, thanking him for the opportunity to participate in the evaluation flight and expressing willingness to provide any additional information that might be required for program completion. Her response was professionally appropriate but maintained the same careful boundaries that had characterized all of her interactions with military personnel at Meridian. She gathered her flight gear and prepared to leave the debriefing room, her demeanor unchanged despite the underlying tensions that had emerged during their discussion. As Mitchell left the debriefing facility, Torres remained at the table reviewing his notes and considering the implications of what he had observed during the FAIMO evaluation flight. The quiet civilian pilot had demonstrated flying skills that rivaled those of experienced military aviators, but the source of such capabilities remained unexplained. His report would need to reflect both her exceptional performance and the questions about her background that would require additional investigation. The afternoon sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon as Mitchell walked across the base toward the parking area where her rental car waited. The day's activities had proceeded exactly as she had feared they would, with her performance revealing capabilities that would be difficult to explain without acknowledging aspects of her background that she had spent 8 years trying to conceal. The evaluation flight had been successful from a technical standpoint, but it had also created scrutiny that threatened the carefully constructed civilian identity she had maintained since leaving active duty. Other personnel moved across the base with the purposeful activity that characterized military installations during operational hours. Flight crews prepared for evening training missions. Maintenance personnel conducted routine inspections of aircraft scheduled for the next day's activities, and administrative staff completed the paperwork that supported all aspects of military aviation operations. The routine activities continued around Mitchell, but she felt increasingly isolated from the community she had once been part of, walking among people who shared experiences and purpose that she had deliberately abandoned. The drive back to her temporary apartment provided time for Mitchell to consider the implications of the day's events and the likelihood that additional scrutiny would follow Torres's evaluation report. Her performance during the flight had exceeded her own expectations, revealing muscle memory and instinctive responses that 8 years of civilian flying hadn't completely erased. The return to high-performance military aviation had triggered responses that were deeply ingrained, making it impossible to hide the extent of her actual experience and training. Harbor View Complex appeared unchanged from that morning, its neat rows of temporary housing units occupied by the transient population of military personnel and civilian contractors who supported operations at various installations throughout the Gulf Coast region. Mitchell's apartment remained as she had left it, sparse and functional, containing few personal items that might reveal information about her background or previous experiences. The anonymity that had characterized her living arrangements for 8 years suddenly felt inadequate for the level of scrutiny she was likely to face. The evening routine that had governed Mitchell's life for 8 years felt different as she considered the likelihood that her carefully maintained civilian identity was beginning to unravel. Her daily run along Mobile Bay would continue, but the solitude it provided might soon be interrupted by questions from people who were beginning to suspect that her background contained elements that weren't reflected in her official documentation. The civilian aviation community, where she had worked for years, might also face scrutiny as investigators sought to understand how she had acquired capabilities that exceeded typical civilian pilot training. The laptop computer that Mitchell used for study and communication contained files and documents that supported her civilian identity, but also represented a carefully constructed facade that might not withstand detailed investigation. Her financial records, employment history, and personal relationships had all been managed to create the impression of a competent but unremarkable civilian pilot whose background contained nothing that would attract attention from military or government investigators. As darkness settled over the Gulf Coast, Mitchell sat in her apartment considering options that were increasingly limited by the day's events. Her participation in the civilian pilot evaluation program had been voluntary, driven by financial necessity and curiosity about whether she could still perform at the level she had once achieved. The program had offered an opportunity to return to high-performance aviation while maintaining her civilian identity, but her exceptional performance had created questions that threatened to expose the very background she had spent 8 years trying to conceal. The telephone beside her bed remained silent, but Mitchell expected that it would soon carry calls from military personnel seeking additional information about her background and qualifications. The debriefing with Torres had been professional and respectful, but it had also made clear that her performance had raised questions that would require answers. The careful balance between demonstrating competence and concealing expertise had proven impossible to maintain during actual flight operations in a high-performance military aircraft. Mitchell opened her laptop and reviewed the email messages that had accumulated during the day, finding routine communications from civilian employers and aviation organizations that were unaware of her current activities at Meridian Naval Air Station. The messages represented the civilian life she had built over 8 years, a network of professional relationships and employment opportunities that had provided both income and cover for her true background. However, the connections that had once provided security now felt fragile and potentially compromised by the attention her performance was likely to generate. The decision to participate in the evaluation program had been carefully considered, with Mitchell weighing the risks of exposure against the financial benefits and the opportunity to return to high-performance aviation. She had believed that 8 years of civilian flying had dulled her military skills sufficiently to allow competent but unremarkable performance that wouldn't attract undue attention. The assumption had proven incorrect, with her capabilities proving more persistent than anticipated, and her performance during the evaluation flight revealing skills that civilian training alone couldn't explain. As Mitchell prepared for sleep, she realized that the events of the day had fundamentally changed her situation regardless of how the evaluation program ultimately concluded. Her return to military aviation had awakened capabilities and responses that she had spent years trying to suppress, making it increasingly difficult to maintain the civilian identity that had provided protection from a past she preferred to leave undisturbed. The question was no longer whether she could successfully complete the evaluation program, but whether she could manage the consequences of the attention her performance had already generated. The night sounds of the Gulf Coast filtered through the apartment windows as Mitchell considered the likelihood that her 8-year effort to remain anonymous was approaching its end. The quiet civilian pilot who had successfully avoided attention for nearly a decade had revealed capabilities during a single evaluation flight that would be impossible to explain without acknowledging military experience that wasn't reflected in any official documentation. The carefully constructed facade that had protected her civilian identity was beginning to crumble under scrutiny that she had successfully avoided for 8 years. Sleep came slowly that night, interrupted by memories of a different time when Mitchell had worn a different uniform and flown in formations that required precision measured in inches rather than feet. The Blue Angels had represented the pinnacle of military aviation excellence, but they had also been part of a life that she had deliberately abandoned after events that still caused pain 8 years later. The evaluation flight at Meridian had awakened memories and capabilities that she had spent years trying to forget, forcing her to confront the possibility that her past was about to become part of her present, regardless of her preferences. The morning would bring new challenges as Torres prepared his evaluation report, and other personnel at Meridian began to ask questions about the civilian pilot whose performance had exceeded all expectations. Mitchell understood that her options were becoming increasingly limited, with each interaction potentially revealing additional information about a background that she had successfully concealed for 8 years. The quiet anonymity that had characterized her civilian life was ending, replaced by scrutiny that would eventually require explanations she wasn't prepared to provide. As the first light of dawn appeared over Mobile Bay, Mitchell realized that her participation in the civilian pilot evaluation program had set in motion events that would ultimately require her to choose between continued concealment of her true background and acknowledgement of capabilities that could only be explained by military experience that officially didn't exist. The decision she had avoided for 8 years was rapidly approaching, forced by circumstances that she had created through her own exceptional performance in an aircraft that she had once known as intimately as her own heartbeat. The evaluation flight had lasted only 2 hours, but it had fundamentally altered the trajectory of a life that Mitchell had spent 8 years carefully constructing around the principle of avoiding attention that might lead to questions about her past. The quiet civilian pilot who had successfully maintained her anonymity was about to face scrutiny that would test whether 8 years of careful identity management could withstand investigation by people who understood military aviation well, enough to recognize capabilities that civilian training alone couldn't provide. The sound of her alarm clock would soon signal the beginning of another day at Meridian Naval Air Station, where Mitchell would face questions about her background while trying to maintain the civilian identity that had provided protection from a military past that contained experiences she preferred to keep private. The evaluation program would continue, but the focus had shifted from assessing civilian pilot capabilities to understanding how those capabilities had been acquired by someone whose official background suggested no access to the training and experience that her performance clearly demonstrated. The morning run along Mobile Bay would provide temporary escape from the questions and scrutiny that awaited at the base, but Mitchell understood that her 8-year effort to avoid confronting her past was rapidly approaching its conclusion. The evaluation flight had revealed not only her continuing ability to fly high-performance military aircraft, but also the impossibility of concealing such capabilities from people who possessed the knowledge and experience to recognize their significance. As she prepared for what would prove to be a pivotal day in her carefully managed civilian life, Mitchell realized that her participation in the evaluation program had been a mistake that would ultimately force her to choose between continued deception about her background and acknowledgement of a military past that she had spent 8 years trying to forget. The quiet anonymity that had characterized her civilian identity was ending, replaced by attention that would eventually require explanations about experiences that she had hoped would remain forever buried in classified files that officially didn't acknowledge her existence. The second evaluation flight was scheduled for Thursday morning, 3 days after Sarah Mitchell's initial assessment had left Captain Torres with more questions than answers. The intervening days had seen unusual activity in the administrative offices at Meridian Naval Air Station, with personnel from various departments quietly reviewing files, making phone calls, and conducting research that seemed disproportionate to a routine civilian pilot evaluation. Mitchell had noticed the increased attention during her daily visits to the base, observing conversations that stopped when she approached and glances that lingered longer than military courtesy typically required. Commander Harrison had requested a meeting with Mitchell on Wednesday afternoon, ostensibly to discuss the continuation of her evaluation program, but clearly intended to probe deeper into aspects of her background that had raised questions following her exceptional flight performance. The meeting took place in Harrison's office, with its views of the flight line and displays of military aviation history that served as constant reminders of the institution's purpose and traditions. Harrison's approach was professional but persistent, seeking clarification about Mitchell's previous flying experience and the sources of training that had produced capabilities that exceeded typical civilian pilot standards. Mitchell's responses during the meeting had maintained the same careful boundaries that characterized all of her interactions with military personnel, acknowledging her preparation and experience while avoiding specific details that might reveal the extent of her actual background. However, the questions had become more pointed and detailed, suggesting that additional research was being conducted into her documented history and the accuracy of the information she had provided. The meeting concluded with Harrison's statement that the evaluation program would continue as planned, But Mitchell sensed underlying tensions that suggested her situation was becoming increasingly precarious. The evening before her second evaluation flight, Mitchell received a phone call at her apartment that changed everything. The caller identified himself as Colonel Robert van der Berk, visiting from Naval Air Systems Command Headquarters, and requested a private meeting to discuss her participation in the evaluation program. The tone of the conversation was polite but official, with undertones that suggested the meeting wasn't optional despite being phrased as a request. Van der Berk proposed meeting for breakfast at a restaurant off base, away from the official environment of Meridian Naval Air Station. Mitchell arrived at the designated restaurant 15 minutes early, selecting a corner table that provided clear views of the entrance and parking area, while offering privacy for conversation. The establishment was typical of businesses that catered to military personnel, with reasonable prices, efficient service, and an atmosphere that encouraged professional discussions without being formal or intimidating. Other patrons included uniformed personnel from various installations in the area, creating an environment where military conversations were common and unremarkable. Colonel van der Berk arrived precisely on time, wearing civilian clothes that didn't disguise his military bearing or the confident authority that came from decades of command experience. He was approximately 55 years old, with graying hair and the weathered appearance of someone who had spent considerable time in operational aviation before transitioning to administrative responsibilities. His handshake was firm and his manner direct, suggesting someone who preferred straightforward communication over diplomatic circumlocution. The initial conversation covered routine topics related to Mitchell's experience at Meridian and her impressions of the evaluation program. But van der Berg's questions gradually became more specific and pointed. He demonstrated detailed knowledge of her flight performance, including aspects of her demonstration that hadn't been included in Torres's written report. His information suggested access to additional sources of data about her activities, possibly including radar recordings, radio communications, or observations from personnel who hadn't been officially involved in the evaluation process. When van der Berk began asking about Mitchell's previous military service, her carefully maintained facade finally began to crack. The question was phrased casually, almost as an assumption rather than an inquiry, but it struck at the foundation of the civilian identity she had constructed over 8 years. Her response was initially defensive, denying any military background while maintaining that her aviation experience had been acquired entirely through civilian channels. However, van der Berg's follow-up questions demonstrated knowledge that made continued denial increasingly difficult to sustain. The conversation reached its crucial turning point when van der Berk placed a manila folder on the table between them and asked Mitchell to review its contents. The folder contained copies of military personnel records, flight training documentation, and official photographs that Mitchell recognized despite their classification markings and restricted distribution notices. The documents detailed a military aviation career that had officially been expunged from all accessible records, but which van der Berk had somehow managed to obtain and verify through channels that Mitchell couldn't identify. The records revealed the truth that Mitchell had spent 8 years trying to conceal. She had served as a naval aviator for 6 years, including 3 seasons as the left-wing pilot for the Blue Angels demonstration team. Her official call sign had been Phantom, reflecting her ability to appear and disappear from formation positions with precision that had made her one of the most skilled demonstration pilots in the team's history. Her departure from active duty had been administratively complex, involving circumstances that had required careful management to avoid public attention and potential damage to the Blue Angels' reputation. Van der Berg's knowledge of these details was comprehensive and accurate, suggesting access to classified information that should have been permanently sealed. He knew about the incident during Mitchell's final season with the Blue Angels that had led to her decision to leave active duty, The administrative negotiations that had allowed her to separate quietly without public controversy, and the agreements that had resulted in the official expungement of her military service records. His information was so detailed and specific that continued denial was impossible, forcing Mitchell to acknowledge the accuracy of his documentation. The revelation transformed their conversation from a routine administrative inquiry into a discussion of national security implications and classified program requirements that Mitchell had hoped never to confront again. Van der Berk explained that her exceptional performance during the evaluation flight had triggered automatic security reviews that had eventually uncovered evidence of her concealed military background. The discovery had raised questions about her motivations for maintaining false identity information and her potential involvement in activities that might compromise classified information or operational security. Mitchell's response to these accusations was measured but emotional, explaining for the first time in 8 years the circumstances that had led to her departure from the Blue Angels and her subsequent decision to completely abandon her military identity. The incident that had ended her Blue Angels career had involved a training accident during a practice session that had resulted in the death of a fellow pilot and close friend. Although the accident investigation had cleared Mitchell of any responsibility or fault, she had been unable to continue flying in formation with the team that reminded her daily of the loss. The emotional trauma of losing someone she had flown with for 2 seasons, combined with the psychological pressure of performing precision aerobatics that required absolute trust and confidence, had made it impossible for Mitchell to continue with the Blue Angels despite official encouragement to remain with the team. Her decision to leave active duty entirely had been driven by her inability to separate the joy of flying from the pain of loss, making civilian aviation seem like the only viable alternative to a military career that had become emotionally unbearable. Van der Berk listened to Mitchell's explanation without interruption, his expression reflecting understanding of the psychological challenges that could end military aviation careers regardless of official policies or support systems. His response acknowledged the legitimacy of her emotional trauma, while explaining that her decision to conceal her military background had created administrative and security complications that required resolution. The 8 years of false identity information had technically violated federal regulations regarding background disclosure, even though her motivations had been personal rather than malicious. The discussion continued for more than 2 hours, covering the legal and administrative implications of Mitchell's concealed background, as well as the potential options for resolving the situation without criminal prosecution or public exposure. Van der Berk explained that her exceptional flying skills and clean security background made her valuable to various military programs that could benefit from her expertise, but that continuation of her civilian facade was no longer possible, given the attention her performance had generated. The resolution proposed by Van der Berk involved Mitchell's voluntary return to active duty status in a capacity that would utilize her exceptional flying skills while accommodating the emotional issues that had originally caused her departure. The Navy's test pilot programs and advanced training schools needed experienced aviators who could work with new aircraft systems and training methodologies, positions that would provide professional satisfaction without the formation flying requirements that had become psychologically difficult for her to manage. Mitchell's initial response to this proposal was resistant, as she had spent 8 years building a civilian life that provided emotional stability and freedom from the military culture that reminded her of painful losses. However, Van der Berg's presentation of the alternatives made it clear that her options were limited by the legal and security implications of her concealed background. Prosecution for providing false information on federal documents was possible, though unlikely given her clean record and the circumstances of her deception. The conversation concluded with Mitchell's agreement to consider Van der Berg's proposal while understanding that her civilian pilot evaluation program would be terminated Regardless of her decision about returning to active duty, her exceptional performance had made it impossible to continue the fiction that she was simply a skilled civilian pilot, and the discovery of her concealed military background had created administrative complications that required official resolution rather than continued concealment. As they prepared to leave the restaurant, Van der Berk provided Mitchell with contact information and a timeline for making her decision about returning to active duty. He emphasized that the Navy's interest in her services was genuine and based on her demonstrated capabilities rather than any desire to punish her for the concealment of her background. The test pilot programs and advanced training positions he had described would provide opportunities to contribute to military aviation development while avoiding the emotional triggers that had originally caused her departure. The drive back to her apartment gave Mitchell time to process the implications of the morning's conversation and the reality that her 8-year effort to maintain civilian anonymity had finally ended. The discovery of her Blue Angels background had been inevitable once her flying performance had demonstrated capabilities that civilian training couldn't explain. But the emotional impact of being forced to confront her military past was still overwhelming despite her intellectual understanding of the situation. The afternoon was spent reviewing the documents that Van der Berk had left with her, including detailed descriptions of the positions available to someone with her qualifications and security clearance. The test pilot programs offered opportunities to work with cutting-edge aircraft and systems while contributing to the development of future military aviation capabilities. The training positions would allow her to share her expertise with younger aviators while remaining in operational flying status without formation requirements. That evening, Mitchell walked along Mobile Bay for what she realized might be the final time as a civilian trying to escape her military past. The familiar route had provided solitude and emotional stability for years, but the conversation with Van der Berk had made it clear that her carefully constructed civilian identity was no longer sustainable. The choice ahead involved embracing a military future that acknowledged her capabilities and background rather than continuing the exhausting effort to conceal them. The decision ultimately came down to a choice between accepting responsibility for her exceptional abilities and the opportunities they created, or attempting to maintain a civilian facade that was no longer believable or sustainable. 8 years of avoiding her military past had provided emotional protection, but had also prevented her from utilizing capabilities that could contribute to important national defense missions and the training of future military aviators. Mitchell's phone call to Van der Berk the following morning was brief and professional, informing him of her decision to accept the return to active duty and the assignment to test pilot training that would begin within 60 days. The conversation included practical details about administrative processing, security clearance reactivation, and the termination of her civilian employment relationships. But the most significant aspect was her acknowledgement that Sarah Mitchell, civilian flight instructor, would cease to exist as her primary identity. The final week at Meridian Naval Air Station involved completing administrative procedures related to the termination of the civilian pilot evaluation program and beginning the process of transitioning back to active military status. The personnel who had questioned her background during the previous weeks now treated her with the professional respect due to someone whose military aviation credentials were exceptional, even if they had been concealed for administrative rather than security reasons. Captain Torres approached Mitchell during her final day at the base, expressing his respect for her flying abilities and his understanding of the circumstances that had led to her concealment of her military background. His comments reflected the professional aviator community's recognition that exceptional flying skills were rare and valuable, regardless of the administrative complications that might surround their discovery and acknowledgement. The departure from Harborview Complex involved packing the minimal personal belongings that had comprised Mitchell's civilian life while mentally preparing for a return to military culture and operational flying. That would require different psychological and professional adjustments. The apartment that had provided sanctuary for someone trying to escape her past was being abandoned by someone ready to embrace a future that acknowledged rather than concealed her exceptional capabilities. The drive away from the Gulf Coast took Mitchell toward a new assignment that would utilize her Blue Angels' experience and exceptional flying skills in service of military programs that needed her expertise. The 8-year effort to remain anonymous had ended with the recognition that exceptional abilities create responsibilities that can't be permanently avoided, and that true professional satisfaction comes from utilizing rather than concealing the capabilities that define individual identity and potential contribution. The story of Sarah Mitchell, civilian flight instructor who had successfully concealed her Blue Angels background for 8 years, concluded with her voluntary return to active duty as a test pilot whose exceptional skills would contribute to the development of future military aviation capabilities. Her journey from concealment to acknowledgement had been forced by circumstances beyond her control, but the resolution provided opportunities for professional fulfillment that had been impossible while maintaining her civilian facade. The lesson embedded in Mitchell's experience was that exceptional abilities create both opportunities and responsibilities that can't be permanently avoided, and that true professional satisfaction requires embracing rather than concealing the capabilities that define individual potential and contribution to important missions. Her 8-year effort to escape her military past had ultimately led to a future that acknowledged and utilized her exceptional skills in service of programs that needed her expertise and experience. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.